Alright, g'day guys, welcome back to Flying with Jace. Time for lesson 6 in the Navigation Basics series, selecting the best checkpoint. Alright, so you're going to be going out on your navs. The initial ones will probably pick the checkpoints for you, but later on in life when you're out and about you need to pick your checkpoints, your turning points. You need to pick the best possible one you can get, and that can be a little bit challenging, and certainly the temptation at the start is to pick what you think is easy that ends up being quite disastrous. So look, here's some tips for selection of the best turning point. It should be easy to find. Remember my old adage, work big to small, natural to man-made. A big lake is easier to find than a small road intersection. A big bitumen runway is easier to find than a short dirt runway. Big. Pick your points as big as you can. It should be unique. If there are two things exactly the same, you can be guaranteed that you'll fly to the wrong one every time. The more unique you can make it, the better. Two lakes side by side can be a little bit catchy. It doesn't have to be exactly on your track, and you'll see this certainly if you're doing navs with me. The first one, we'll be picking points that we're going to be making our checkpoints a beam. So the point can be, if there's a big lake and it's 2 miles to the right of track, and you fly past that lake and you go, yeah, I'm 2 miles from that lake, well, you can just about guarantee that you can put yourself a dot on your map and know that you're on track. It can be close to where you want to go. If you're going to a small grass runway, it can be really quite hard to find. Well, why not, instead of making that runway your turning point, pick the large mountain that's 4 miles from it, or the city that's 2 miles from it. Make that your turn point, fly to that, and then fly to your smaller, harder to find point. Because if you've got a 50-mile leg to a small, hard to find point, it's probably easier to do a 50-mile leg to something big and obvious like a lake or a town, and then do a 2 or 3 mile leg to that small, hard to find point. You much better chance of finding it. There are some specified on the maps for use in, or that should say near, controlled airspace. And we'll look at those in a minute, but there are some defined VFR reporting points that you may need to use. The TV towers are a good example of that. And a little friendly reminder from the bottom there that if you're navigating with visual reference, so if you're VFR, which we will be in our recreational aircraft, you must, and CASA say must, positively fix your aircraft's position by visual reference to features marked on a topographical chart at intervals not exceeding 30 minutes. So, that's only 50 miles apart. You need to be able to pick features so that you can legally put a dot on that map every 30 minutes. And that can be really challenging if you go out west of Longreach or out past Birdsville. It can be quite challenging to actually plan a flight to give you that 30 minutes, and you should be planning to keep that 30 minutes in mind. All right, these are my favourites. You've heard me talk about most of them. Lakes. Big lakes. The bigger the better. They make great turning points. Remember though, they change shape. We looked at that in one of the earlier ones where we looked at lakes. They're fantastic. You can see them for miles, but they change shape, or they may not be there. So you need to do a little bit of thinking if you're flying somewhere that's dry. Rivers with obvious bends. Again, and you'll get to see some of these. The Brisbane River's got some ripper, unique, obvious bends in it that you can fix your position very, very well. Towns and cities with an obvious shape. There might be some close together, and the shape will help you determine which one's which. But also, towns and cities can just be a good spot because, again, they stick out. They're really, really easy to find. Mines. Don't forget the value of a great big open cut mine or a quarry. As you're flying towards it, you can see this thing. It sticks out. It's a big scar in the landscape that's generally marked on your map. Paved runways. Paved runways are awesome. Again, you can generally see them when you're within 5 or 10 miles of them pretty much all the time. And there's not that many of them, so they really meet that unique requirement, especially once you get west of, say, Warwick. The big towns have the airstrips, but that's about it. So that can be really easy. High tension power lines, if there's an obvious crossing point. High tension power lines can stick out really, really well by the big swaths that are cut in the trees, these massive, wide, clear lines. They're awesome. But it's no good if it's just a straight line. You don't know whereabouts on it you are. So if your high tension power lines have an obvious point where two or three or four lots of wires come together, that's awesome. Wind farms. And I should have put power stations in there as well. Wind farms are really good because, again, they're these big white moving things. They really, really stick out. They can be really easy to find. Power stations are the same because they have big chimneys and they punch out miles and miles of smoke and steam. So you can see wind farms and you can see power stations for miles. And we'll have a good look at that when we start heading out west. There's a couple you'll see very obviously. And silos. We looked at silos earlier on. Again, silos are generally on roads. They're generally on roads and railway lines. They stick out quite obviously against a horizon, especially if you're down low, because they'll be the only big obvious thing there. So silos can be really handy. Things that are not necessarily the best things to use. So small or grass runways, they can be really hard to find, especially if they're the same colour as all the surroundings. Find something nearby and let you find them. Small streams and lakes. Now we've talked about using rivers and lakes with obvious bends. Tiny small streams may not be there, or they might be there when it's raining like it is today, but they might not be there in the middle of winter when it's all dried out. Same with small lakes, so try and avoid those. Small towns get built in valleys where you can't see them. Small towns, sometimes it can be difficult to tell the difference between a group of houses and a small town as it's marked on the map. Some maps will mark a group of houses as a small town. It can be really, really tricky. I try to avoid using those, especially if there's something obvious nearby. Don't use towers unless they're fitted with strobes. One of your nabs you're going to see, you're going to have the pleasure of trying to find the Jimna Fire Tower. Towers, whilst they're these big pointy out things on your map, they can actually be really, really hard to find on the ground. Plus, you don't want to be deliberately flying towards towers. You know, I've always thought that's a bit interesting. You don't want to be deliberately flying towards them because what if the visibility is getting bad and you find it? Yeah. The caveat for that is if they're fitted with strobe lights, and you'll see the Brisbane TV towers, for example, are a classic example of that. Road intersections, not a good thing to use unless you're looking at a major highway. If you look at the M1 or the Pacific Coast Highway or something like that, the exits stand out really, really good. Really awesome things to use. But your smaller roads and your road intersections, I just about avoid using a road intersection as a checkpoint because they all look the same on the smaller roads. They really do. Even on something like the Bruxner Highway, it can be difficult to tell which road intersection that is. So you're trying to avoid things like road intersections. Another gotcha. Things that are in a valley or obscured by high ground. So if you look at the town of Esk, or for those of you that have been out to Coralbin Airfield, sometimes you can't see it until you're literally right on top of it. It's there, you can't see it coming until it appears because it's obscured in these tight little valleys. So when you're doing your map reconnaissance, have a good look at that turning point. If it's got high ground all around it, or if it's in the lee of a big hill and you're approaching from the side that the hill is on, it can be really, really tricky to find, and you can fly right past it and not see it because it's hidden in a valley. So if you want to go to somewhere that is like that, maybe pick something big and obvious nearby and navigate to that, and then just a short little leg. Last one, power lines. If it's a long straight line, power lines are great for I've crossed the power line, but where? It can be really, really difficult to work out where you crossed it. All right, here's some classic examples. Lake Samson Vale over here on my map. There's Lake Samson Vale dam wall. That's here, it's just off that. But if you look, you can see all the way down the left here, all the way down, all the way miles down there. That's there. Now, in this picture, we are flying about here. So yeah, that's a good 8 or 9 miles I can see. I could see, in Lake Samson Vale is a good example, you can see that when you're leaving Redcliffe. So wouldn't that be a really big, obvious thing to pick the western edge of Lake Samson Vale like that, or like that, rather than, say, a road intersection, or rather than, say, where the power lines cross the road, or this river here, or this hill. This big, obvious feature to there. Big to small. Some other things. There's that power station I was talking about. Sticks out. This one in particular, you're going to see it on your navs, the steam and stuff coming out of here. You can see that from about 30 miles away. So what an awesome checkpoint. You don't have to fly to it. You might want to, your track might take you 5 miles to the west of it. That's fine. You can see that. It's a really, really good point. This one here, there's another dam wall. This river, really obvious bend, really obvious bends, bridges, unique points, or this big piece of, this big hill here. So if you say, let's make our turning point this big obvious river bend, but it's at the base of this hill. Down here to our quarries that I was talking about. See that quarry? How well does that stand out? And again, you can see that probably 5 miles, 10 miles from it. So what an awesome turning point that is. If you could, and that's marked on the map, so that would make an awesome turning point. Or we've got this one here. There's our silos again. Remember, they stick out. They're really obviously on the side of the road. The tracks, the railway lines, they'll all be there with those silos, so it can help you find your points. Obvious bends in the river, okay? The coastline can be really obvious. Look at this bend here. How obvious is that there? That's awesome. Really obvious to find that point there. Lake Barumba here, beautifully on track. How handy would that be as a checkpoint, as a turning point? Kenilworth Bluff here. That's a nice big one. Another reservoir there. They're all unique. See the unique shape of these towns? They actually look like that when you're flying over them. But here's an example of that one I was talking about for Coralbin. If you look at Coralbin here, you've got these big hills, 17 and 1,200 feet high. The airfield there is at 300 feet. So as you come, if you're coming from this direction, they're hidden. Coralbin is obscured by that. You can't see the airfield till you're about here. Coming from this direction's fine, but coming this way, so that's a classic example of a really bad checkpoint because you just can't see it. You might be better going to something big and obvious and using that for a short leg to Coralbin. Alright, that's the end of that one. As always, guys, give me a yell. Get in touch if you've got any questions or comments on checkpoint selection. Thanks very much for your time. Fly safely.